So even these abstract signifiers were doing the same thing. They were embodying the teachings of the historical Buddha and the charisma that he and his followers had developed through their spiritual practice. And we find this idea that there are relics with all of these different things throughout Asia. We find it, for example, at a site called Kizil. This is right on the border between China and Afghanistan. This, from the 4th to the 7th century, was one of the major oasis kingdoms on the Silk Road. And basically what you have at Kizil are what are called in my business cave temples. So these are man-made caves that have been dug into mountainsides. Some of them were used as libraries, some of them were kitchens, some of them were sleeping quarters, and a healthy proportion, probably 100 of the 300 or so caves at the site, were actually used as temples. So they were embellished with paintings and sculptures telling us the story of Buddhism and showing us various deities. And if you look inside the Kizil caves, one of the things that you almost always find in the major caves is a scene such as this, where you have armored figures riding on horses. In case you're wondering, the people who inhabited this kingdom are thought to have been Tokharians, which means that they were Indo-Europeans, which was why they may look more like some of us than some of you may have anticipated. And on top of them, there are always groups of 7 figures. These are semi-divine figures known as Bodhisattvas. And when you look at what they're holding in their hands, you can see that they have these kind of round containers with conical lids. There are several of them. And in fact, this is a scene of the distribution of the relics. And we have found, or not we have found, there have been found in the area numerous examples of these reliquaries themselves. This is probably one of the most famous, dated to the 5th or 6th century. It's in the Tokyo National Museum. And as you would expect in a site that was very important on the Silk Road, if you look at the cover, you can see that there are these roundels. And on these roundels, there are these little naked winged figures who look very, very much like the putti of Greco-Roman traditions, and probably actually come from that. And then on the body of the reliquary itself, there's this absolutely marvelous scene that may record some type of a funeral procession that would have accrued drumming, dancing, music. And also, if you look very carefully at some of these figures wearing animal masks. And the closest parallels for these figures, you might be interested to know, are actually in the Japanese Gigaku tradition today. The notion of reliquaries also spread to China, and we know from texts that it was extremely important in China all the way around. We know from archaeology, and I should remind you that now, even as we speak, China is in the midst of an archaeological revolution that will ultimately, I believe, change world history. We know from archaeology that, in fact, this practice was particularly important in the late 6th century, when China, which had been subdivided, was once again under unified rule, and in the late 7th century, during the reign of one of the more interesting women in Asian history. Her name is Wu Zetian, or Empress Wu, and she is the only woman to have ruled in China as an empress in her own right, ever in Chinese history. She ruled from 690 to 704. She was a devout Buddhist. One of the reasons that she was probably a devout Buddhist is that because, according to the Confucian worldview, which was so important in China and Korea and Japan, there wasn't a lot of room for women to be rulers. So she found an apocryphal sutra which talked about, purported to be a text from India, talked about the fact that there was going to be a great Buddhist ruler in China, not surprisingly in the late 7th and early 8th century, and that this person was going to be female, and she actively supported the cult of relics. So we have found these really interesting things. This is a stone box which was found in an excavation in 1964. The story on the box tells us the story of what happened to it. Apparently, this was an excavation in northwest China. There was a pagoda. And the pagoda was constantly emitting these mysterious rays of light. So local magistrates and local monks got together and contemplated the meaning of this obviously auspicious event, and they decided to dig under the pagoda. And under the pagoda, they found relics, most likely relics that had been enshrined there in the late 6th century AD by the Chinese. But they decided that these relics were in fact part of the 84,000 that our friend the Emperor Ashoka had disseminated, now apparently all the way to China. So they excavated under the pagoda, they took everything out. What they basically found were small grains of rice, which in China, rice or sand, have often been sort of the centerpieces of pagodas, and they reburied it in a glass bottle, which was placed in a gold casket, which was placed in a silver casket, which was placed in a bronze box, which was placed in our stone reliquary that we were just looking at. And they have found relics of this type all the way in Chinese culture. I'm showing you a monastery in Xi'an, which is very near where that terracotta army was found, which is the Fa Mansu monastery, which was reconstructed in 1987 and then excavated. Historical records tell us that there were numerous relics housed at this monastery, that the relics in this pagoda were periodically paraded throughout the capital city and revered by the emperor and the empress, that the last time this was done was in 1873, and in fact, when they tried to shore the pagoda up, and they dug under it. Okay. Did I do something? Help? Okay. They dug under it. Let's see if we can do this. This is my fault, probably. Oh, wait a minute. Okay. When they tried to shore the pagoda up and they dug under it, they found 4 chambers in which there were 3 different sets of reliquaries. And in the back chamber, which in Chinese archaeology is always the most important, they found a hidden floor. And in the hidden floor, they found another reliquary, which was this one, which contained a metal or iron box, a gold casket, a glass casket, and a jade casket. And in the jade casket, there was a finger bone. And it is genuinely believed by a great many people in Asia that this, in fact, was the finger bone of the historical Buddha Shakyamuni. So this bone, which was excavated in 1978, has in fact traveled throughout all of Asia and been venerated in numerous Buddhist centers. When I was in Hong Kong 4 years ago, it was there, and there was a statement in the local paper that said, "China gives Hong Kong the finger," which I thought was a political statement at first. Okay, so we go back to Sanchi, and what I wanted to tell you, and which is kind of interesting for our purposes, is that in these early monuments in India, the Buddha was never shown in anthropomorphic form. In fact, he was always shown symbolically, either in the shape of a stupa, as you can see here, or sometimes as a log. This is a famous miracle by Siddhartha Gautama where he walked on water. And it is not until the 2nd century AD, where again within the context of relics, so at first only on these stupas, that you find the Buddha in human form both here in the north and here in the south. And this leads to a really interesting question, because although the cult of the stupa pagoda contributes over time, it's not really clear to me the degree to which these freestanding sculptural figures that we start finding in the 2nd century AD were thought to be equivalent to the relics of the Buddha.